And we're back. Hey, everyone. I'm your host, Lawrence, a technical program manager on the PM team at Figma, and I'm bringing you the last session of the day and of Config 2023. Have y'all been having a good time? All right. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to recognize the entire team behind the scenes here. Our planning team, operations team, this front of house, back of house, event staff, volunteers. The coordination it takes is just mind-boggling. So let's give these people a round of applause. And of course, without our wonderful guest speakers and all of you in the audience, this wouldn't be happening. So please give yourselves a hand as well. Wow, time really flies when you're hanging out with this amazing community. Now get comfy in those seats or in your couches at home, because we have one more riveting talk for you on this stage. We've all seen how complicated or even frustrating it can be to ship a design to production faithfully. If you're a designer, you may have seen one of your designs in prod and asked yourself, what happened? But don't worry, your handoff and implementation woes are about to be a thing of the past. Coming up, we have Varun Vachhar from the developer experience team at Chromatic to shed some light on how we can improve the designer to developer to production workflow. Please give one more warm config welcome to Varun.
Hi, everyone. So last session of config, we have to end on a high. No pressure. My name is Varun. I'm part of the developer experience team at Chromatic and also a core contributor to Storybook. I started off my professional career as a designer before switching into development, so I kind of understand the pain points of both sides and both the crafts. And that's kind of what I want to focus on today. I'm going to be talking about how you can combine Storybook and Figma into a fairly efficient workflow. This was one of the first projects I ever worked on as a professional developer. It's a little app to track workouts, has this beautiful early mobile UI before we actually figured out how to make good-looking mobile apps. And we certainly started off with a set of designs, but I ended up going back and forth with the designer quite a lot to nail the UI and actually build it out and figure out all the little interactions, especially the swipey bits. And I kind of put that down to a lack of experience. I figured as I progress in my career, what's going to happen is more of a linear workflow where the designers gather a bunch of requirements, create the designs. They pass that over to me as a developer. I'll code them up, and then we ship it, and everything's good. Except that never happened. Not once. I feel like that the back and forth between designers and developers just never went away, and that's just a reality of how we work. If we try to enforce a linear workflow, things kind of break down. It's more like that game of telephone where you go from one person to the next, and the message just ends up getting mangled. And that's not anyone's fault. It's just a side effect of this forcing a linear workflow onto something that's not really linear, and forcing people to work in more of a silo. And what happens is if you try to enforce that linear workflow, folks end up getting blocked. Again, not because it's someone's fault, but communication breaks down, and it's unclear what the requirements are and what exactly am I supposed to be building. And this is also a big reason why folks start to feel like they're not part of a team. They're just a little cog in a machine, and they're just being told what to do. And the other bit is, as a designer, if you've ever looked at the UI your team's shipped and gone, what have they done to my designs? This is why. Because that communication breaks down, and we end up shipping stuff that is less than ideal. In reality, the UI workflow is much more of a loop, where we actually have affordances to go back and forth between designers and developers in order to account for those changes that are going to happen. We start off with some set of designs, but we know that once we get into engineering, things come up. We end up hitting some kind of roadblock or discovering new constraints, and we have to account for that and make changes to the UI before we actually code it up and ship it. So today, I want to talk about this workflow, and we'll go through this step by step. And I'll share a few different patterns that you can adopt in order to make this a really efficient workflow and ship high-quality UIs with your team. So let's start at design. Now, we've come a long way since where the web started. Back then, websites used to be static pages, mostly linked to each other using links, hyperlinks. But if you fast forward to today, websites are way more complex. They're made up of hundreds, if not thousands of pages, all kinds of interactivity on the page. And to work at that scale, what we've done, and you all use Figma, so you are very much aware of this, we use components. So we slice up the UI into reusable chunks that allow us to work at that scale. We're able to build stuff that is websites that are made up of these hundreds of thousands of pages. But that's just one layer of complexity. There's an additional layer of complexity that comes from how the UI responds when the application is running live. So the UIs that we build, they are responsive. They respond to the different viewport sizes where the websites run. They're accessible, so you might have multiple color modes, or the animations might be turned off if the user has that as a preference. Quite often, we build applications that are personalized, so users have the ability to control the look and feel of the application. Plus, you have various application states. So the UI responds to what's happening on the page right now, how the user is interacting with it. And then you layer on sort of the asynchronous nature of the applications that comes from fetching data from the back end. So there's loading states and error states. And let me illustrate this with a little example. So here I have a little food delivery application. You go in, you select a restaurant that you want to order your dinner from that day. Now, this card on the surface looks quite straightforward, but if you dig into it, what you'll find is it has many different variants depending on the application state. So when there's a default mode for the card, when the restaurant is newly added to the system, if it's closed for the day, or, of course, when the application is loading up. And then the other layer that comes up is through color mode. So there might be a light variant, a dark variant, responsive variants. You might have localization to account for, so different languages that your application might support. All of that kind of adds up really, really quickly, and you end up with a tremendous amount of states that you have to account for and actually design and then build them out. So how do we deal with that on the design side of things? We use variants. And quite often, we assemble these sticker sheets where you have each state of the component represented in a fairly granular way. Previously, this used to be a fairly manual process, but now you can use sections and variables and all kinds of nice things to build out these sticker sheets. But the idea is you're representing all the different ways that a component looks within the application in one section that the user that sort of makes it really clear what is the scope of the work. And these variants work really great. And in fact, they end up being the foundation for both handoff and the development part of the process. So as a developer, this sticker sheet is essentially the spec for what I'm building. It tells me exactly what components need to be built out and what are the different versions of that component that I need to build out. The tricky bit is when we're assembling these sticker sheets in Figma, it's a relatively straightforward process. It's not easy, but it's straightforward because variants are a built-in concept inside Figma. You can actually create a component that has multiple variants. If you try to do the same thing for coded components, things get way, way tricky. And the reason for that is coded components are actually plugged into your backend APIs, the database, application state, all kinds of things that are impacting how the application runs in the real world. And what that means is if you want to work on a specific state of that component, look at how this component looks in the loading state or one of the other states, you actually have to spin up the entire application, ensure that you have some kind of mock data if you're running this locally on your computer. And then, quite often, you have to click around to get to the right page where the component lives and get the UI in just the right state. And often, that's not enough either. What you end up having to do is jumping into code, and adding manual overrides to figure out how to trigger a particular state. Manual overrides for the close state, for the loading state, and so on. And sometimes even that's not enough, because you might not have an input in a component that controls a particular state. You might have to bash your head against the browser dev tools to trigger a network loading state or a failure state to see what the UI looks like in those states. And the sad part is, once you've done all of this work, you were working on that component, you built it out, and you come back to it 6 months later, you have to do that all over again. Or if another teammate wants to come and work on that component, fix a bug, they have to do that all over again, because there's no way for you to save all those code variants in a replicable way. And the other bit of complexity here is developers aren't the only one who want to see what the coded component looks like in different states. If you have folks on your team who want to go and see what the UI looks like in a particular state, and they're not comfortable with those code overrides, it's just not even accessible to them. It acts as a blocker for them to go and see what the UI looks like in production. And that's where Storybook comes in. Storybook is a tool that's purposefully built to give you that sticker sheet for your coded components. And the way that works is it actually detaches your components from your application and isolates them. And that's the magic. While your component is inside the application, it's quite hard to replicate the different states because it's plugged into all of those real-world things that are impacting your application. But once you detach it, you can actually supply all the inputs that need to go inside that component to render the different UI states. And the mechanism for doing that in Storybook is something called a story. And this is an example of what a story looks like for that default state of the restaurant card component. A story has this one property called args, which specifies all the inputs that need to go into a component to render a particular UI state. So we do this for the default state, and we'll replicate that process for all of the other states that this component has, and write out the stories for all the different variants of that particular component. And then Storybook is responsible for rendering that component in the browser, and you're able to go through and view what that component looks like in different states. And these stories that you're writing, they're stored in a stories file that sits alongside the source code. So they're tracked in your Git repository, much like your code. So anytime you want to work on a component, you simply spin it up in Storybook, and you're able to see what are the different UI states of that component and actually view them in the browser. Now, there are other aspects that impact how the UI is rendered that are not just inputs into a component. These are things that sort of live at the application level. And honestly, after the keynote yesterday, variables is a really great way to think about it. So which theme is currently active, or what viewport is currently active, or again, if you have localization, which language is currently active. These are all variables that run at the application level. And with Storybook, you're able to also configure those variables in order to write stories for different that impact how the component is rendered. And of course, you're building an application, so as you start going higher into the application tree, you have various components where they might be fetching data from the back end and actually making some API calls. So with Storybook, you're able to mock that right inside the story file itself, and that allows you to capture variants for a more complex component too. And then lastly, in certain cases, you can only get to a UI state once the user interacts with the UI. For example, they click a button and that pops open a modal, or the user fills out a form and that triggers different kinds of validations. And in order to do that, you can simulate user interactions right inside your story file too, and that allows you to, again, capture the last type of variant that the UI can have. With all of this, what's happening is, with stories, we have a mechanism to capture variants for the coded components. And the cool thing is they map back to variants inside Figma. So both designers and developers now have the same shared mental model. You're developing that language where if I call something a button and if I call something the primary state of a button, that means the same thing to me, whether I'm a designer or a developer on the team. And honestly, this is a fantastic start. But once you start building out this component, what happens is you're still kind of going back and forth between two tools. You're tabbing back and forth between Figma and Storybook and VS Code. And that can be frustrating, especially as you start building more complex UIs. And let me share an example of or share an example that illustrates this issue. So last year, I helped the Storybook team refresh our website. We updated some of the core UI patterns and introduced some new UI elements. Under the hood, this website is really a collection of multiple websites. We have a few marketing pages. We have a documentation site, much like any other tool that you all use. We also have a blog and a tutorial site, which has translations in different languages and even versions of each tutorial for different front-end frameworks that Storybook supports. And we also have something called an integration catalog. So much like how Figma has a plugin ecosystem, Storybook has an add-on ecosystem. And this is where you would go and find those plugins and add-ons. And we also have something called a component encyclopedia. So thousands of teams use Storybook every day to build out their UIs. And quite often, they publish these storybooks publicly. And what we do is we go and index all of the publicly available storybooks and collate them here on the component encyclopedia. So if you want to see how other folks are using Storybook, you're able to dive in and check out their storybook or explore components of a specific type. So as you can see, there's a lot of different things that the user can do on this website. And previously, it was a somewhat disjointed experience where each section of the website had a different header. So one of the big changes that we wanted to do was actually unify the entire website to use the same global header. And in this header, there were 3 parts. There was an eyebrow, which shared some global updates as to what's new happening within the Storybook ecosystem, the nav, which allows you to navigate between the different parts, and a subnav, which had page-specific interactions. And of course, the header had multiple variants based on theming. So there was a light mode, a dark mode, a monochromatic mode. It responds to viewport sizes to collapse in different ways. And the subnav bit had a bit of sort of interesting thing, because these were page-specific interactions. We ended up creating a whole bunch of UI controls that you could mix and match depending on the needs of a particular page. So that's a lot of stuff to keep in your mind when you're trying to build out this header. So anything that could reduce that back and forth between Figma and Storybook and VS Code would make my life as a developer much, much easier. And one thing you can do to do that is have the coded UI and the designs sit side by side. And that's exactly what Storybook enables you to do. You're able to embed Figma files right inside Storybook, so you can compare what the designs look like right next to the UI that you're building out. And again, the cool thing is, because those stories map back to variants one-to-one, you don't have to embed the entire Figma file. You can actually choose to embed just the designs for that specific component. So that sort of reduces the complexity when you're working on a component. You can be focused on just the designs for that one particular component, use the inspect mode to inspect the design files right inside Storybook while you're building out the UI. So at this stage where we started off with designs in Figma, we used variants to define all the different states of the component that we're building out, and we started coding that up. And once that development process starts, questions come up. Questions where you start to encounter technical roadblocks or discover constraints that you had not previously accounted for, and that leads to challenges that you need to overcome as a team. And quite often what happens is there is a tendency for developers, and I am one, so I can sort of cop up to it, to just make a decision and run with it and not really bring designers into the loop. So how do you make those decisions together as a team where one craft within the team doesn't feel left out? And again, I'll go back to that subnav example that I shared earlier. We had a bunch of these different controls that you combine together based on the needs of the page. But once we started plugging in real-world data and actually implementing this subnav on different pages, we realized that there were scenarios that came up that we hadn't accounted for previously. Stuff like, what happens when there's a really, really long backlink? Do we trim it using ellipses, or do we hide some other control that's within the subnav? Or this dropdown, 99% of the time, we just needed this straightforward dropdown. except this one place in the app where we needed this special dropdown, which we forgot about. So we had to go back and build out this, or spec out and then build out this dropdown that had groupings for different items and the ability to have icons for different items inside the dropdown. So stuff like this is extremely common in UI engineering. It's unpredictable. You start building out stuff, and you discover that you did your best to try and account for every single UI state, but you missed something. Or you hit some kind of technical roadblock, and you have to account for that and make changes to the UI, make changes to the design, and then actually build it out. So how do you ensure that you're making those decisions together as a team? And this is where we can learn from developers. Developers have essentially operationalized that idea of how to capture feedback on the work that they're doing. So when devs are working on their code, it's tracked using version control. And once a developer is ready to ship their whatever feature that they're building out, they open up a pull request. And at this stage, they'll invite other developers to come and review their code, provide feedback, suggest any changes, or if they find that there are changes that need to be made, they're able to track all of those changes right here on the pull request itself. So what if we do the same thing, but for designers? So we still start off at that pull request phase, where once you're ready to ship something, you spin up that pull request. But at that stage, instead of reviewing code, you invite designers to come and review the actual rendered UI and go through that same feedback process, capture their feedback, look for whatever changes that need to happen. And once everyone is happy, then you approve the UI review, and you can continue with the rest of your workflow. So the big question is, how do you actually run this UI review? We don't have GitHub for UI review. Well, one option is to use something called deploy previews. So this is a fairly common pattern that a lot of engineering teams use. When you open up a pull request, they'll deploy a preview version of the application where you can go in and see what the UI looks like for just that particular pull request. And the cool thing is tools like Netlify or Vercel even allow you to go and leave comments on specific parts of the UI. And honestly, this is a fantastic way to work. You can go in and you can bring designers into that process and start getting them to validate any kind of changes that came up during the process. But the thing is, we very quickly hit that same issue as in development mode, where the UI has many different variants. Some you can get to just by clicking around, and others you can't get to because you have to rely on code overrides or getting really, really creative with developer tools. So that gets really tedious, and that makes it really hard for folks to actually go and review just a specific change that's associated with a particular pull request. So our thought as the Storybook team was, why not use stories? With stories, we've already captured all the different versions of a particular component, how it looks like in different states. So why not invite folks to actually use stories to review the rendered UI? And that's precisely what Chromatic enables. Chromatic extends Storybook's functionality into a cloud workspace where you can facilitate UI review and visual testing. You can think of it as multiplayer mode for Storybook. So how does it work? Again, going back to that pull request, because that's the starting point for anything that's happening here. When the developer is ready to ship their work, they'll open up a pull request. At that point, you'll trigger a Chromatic build. Chromatic will go through your pull request and your code base and find all the different components and all the different stories that you have in your Storybook and index them. At that stage, you go in and invite designers, product managers, or any other stakeholders on your team to come and review the rendered UI associated with that pull request. And the cool thing here is, because we're working at the level of stories, Chromatic is able to tell whether the change happened for a particular component or a particular state of that component. So you don't have to go and review every single piece of UI in your application. It can generate a change set for you that pinpoints what exactly changed, so you know what to go and review. And again, because we're using stories here, these stories rendered live in the browser, so you don't have to rely on taking screenshots or recording GIFs and sharing that with your team to tell them, hey, this is the bit that I'm talking about, and here's what I want you to change. You can actually just pin a comment to a specific story, and the conversation just gets tracked there, and you're able to work through any changes that you might want to make. And this way, much like code reviews for developers, all the changes that you want to make are tracked in one singular location, which makes it relatively straightforward to have that conversation and work through any changes that you want to as a team. So really, what we're doing here is giving power back to designers. So we're not sort of excluding them from that change process. We know we're going to make some changes during the UI engineering process, but this way we're able to make those changes together as a team. So gathering feedback is one aspect of UI review. The other aspect is catching any kind of unintentional changes. Quite often you have multiple developers working in the same code base, multiple teams working in the same code base, and accidents happen. You try to work on one component, and you accidentally break a layout somewhere else on a different page. And going back to that Storybook website example that I shared, that website is built using close to 250 components and has over 700 stories in our Storybook. That's a decent amount. I've seen more complex applications with well over 2,000 or even 5,000 stories. At that scale, you're not able to go through and look at every single story or every piece of the UI to see whether something changed accidentally or not. The only way we can do that is using some kind of automation. And one really, really awesome way to do that is using something called visual regression testing. And the idea behind visual regression testing is you render the UI in an actual browser, capture a snapshot, and then compare it to a previously accepted baseline version. And that way, you're able to do a pixel-by-pixel comparison and see if something changed accidentally or not. And again, this is something that's built into Chromatic, and Chromatic will run visual tests for you. The kind of interesting bit here is Chromatic, again, uses stories as the test cases. So with stories, we've captured all the different states of a component, all the different ways that it renders, and by running visual tests, we're able to check to see if something changed accidentally or if there's a new change that you want to make to the UI that is intentional. So when you run visual tests, you're able to go through and view all the changes and either approve them and continue and say, yeah, the UI should change and look like this in the future. Or if it's an accidental change, then that's a trigger for the developer to see why did this change and maybe go back and fix the bug in their code. And this is a fantastic way to catch those accidental changes. So we started in design line, built out the variants, coded up those variants as stories, and at this stage, we've even shipped the UI. During that process, we know that there were some changes that were made. Where we started off in the design file, in the Figma file, and what's in production is not the same. So quite often, you have to go back to the design file and actually update that to match what's in production. And that's where the big question is, how do you compare what's in production to what's inside the Figma file? So back in the development phase, I talked about how you can have coded UI and Figma file side by side, which makes it easy to compare the two. What if we did the same thing for designers? And that's exactly what the Storybook Connect plugin does. It runs inside Figma. It allows you to connect variants inside your Figma file to stories that are inside your Storybook, and actually embed those stories inside the Figma file, so you can compare what a particular component looks like in production versus what the designs look like in the Figma file. The way this works is you select a particular variant in your Figma file, you run the plugin, and these are slightly older screenshots because my slides were built before dev mode was announced, but this plugin has been updated and now is part of dev mode. So when you run the plugin, after selecting a Figma variant, you get a window pops up which allows you to paste a link to a specific story that you want to link that variant to. And once you do that, you'll see this view story link in the sidebar. Click that, and you'll be able to launch a window inside Figma that renders the live story. And this is the same story that's running in your application in production, but now running inside Figma. Under the hood, this is powered by Chromatic. So Chromatic is that shared workspace where you publish your storybook, and it indexes all the stories inside that storybook. And as your team is working on the UI, you're updating variants that are in Figma, you're publishing updates to the UI in your storybook, and Chromatic ensures that the two stay in sync. So if there's new versions of stories that are being published or if the Figma variant gets updated, it's able to ensure that you're always pulling the latest version once you link the two together. And Chromatic also acts as a central hub for all of your UI. So like I said, it indexes all of your components. So if you go to the library view inside Chromatic, you're able to go and look at each component individually and all of their different stories. And you can tab between different modes of that component. The canvas mode will render the live story. The snapshot tab will render the actual snapshot that it captured during visual testing. And the design tab will actually pull in the Figma file associated with that particular component. So you have live UI and the design side by side throughout all of your tooling. And that idea of stories or variants extends across all of your tooling, starting with Figma, then Storybook, and then lastly, Chromatic, which makes it relatively straightforward to build that shared language with your team between designers and developers. So when you call something a button or a dropdown, you're all referring to the same thing. And if we zoom back out slightly and look at that workflow, that concept of variants actually extends through the entire workflow. So we start by designing the UI and all the different versions of that component using variants. Then we use those variants for handoff. It's essentially the spec for a developer. This is the component that you're building, and these are all the different ways that that component renders depending on the application state. Then developers build out that component inside Storybook, and they capture all the variants for the coded component as stories inside Storybook. We then use those stories to facilitate UI review and even run automated visual tests. And then lastly, we're able to have those, because we have that mapping between variants in Figma and stories, we're able to compare what the production UI looks like to what's in the design file and ensure the two are synchronized. And what this all enables is there's just much less context switching. Devs don't have to, or if you're a developer, you might be comfortable living inside Storybook. If you're a designer, you might be comfortable living inside Figma. It doesn't matter what tool you're using, you always have access to both the coded UI and the designs available to you in the same tool. So you're not tabbing back and forth between different tools. It also means that you can bring in folks to get timely feedback and make those changes that are going to happen in this process, but make them together as a team. And then lastly, by using stories as test cases for visual testing, you're able to catch any accidental changes to your coded UI that's running in production. The title of my talk was about how to ship pixel-perfect UIs, and I have to acknowledge that is a bit of a lie. You're not going to be able to start with a set of designs and ship it exactly pixel by pixel, the same thing in production. But the important thing here is, if you started with a set of designs, how do you ensure that you're shipping something that is staying true to the original design vision? And by using this variant approach, you're able to do that. Thank you.